I Tonight, of course, the subject is guilt, and since it's also a season of confession, I would confess that I always fantasized about being a priest because priests get to hear confession, and rabbis don't officially. I mean, it may happen, but it's not part of what we do. And you get to hear all these juicy stories about people. They come and confide in you, and that would be really exciting. Of course, the difficult part is that you can't tell anybody. So you find out all these incredible secrets about people, but you can't share it with the world, and so that would probably make it challenging. Maybe that's why we don't have that process, and it would be hard in the shul to fit the booths in for confession. But it would be an interesting project nonetheless. So let's talk a bit about guilt and the way the topic that I formulated about 6 weeks ago. I'm going to deviate a little bit from it. The topic was presumed guilty, High Holy Day liturgy, and the human condition. I'm more going to be focusing on the Jewish condition, but I guess there's a basis for that because generally in Jewish traditional Jewish literature, uh, when you say human, you really mean Jews, and vice versa. I mean, you say in Yiddish, uh, a Yid is gegangen auf der Gas, that would normally be translated as a man is walking down the street, not a Jew walking down the street, because you assume everyone your whole basis of interest is the Jewish world. So that tends to be the way we look at things, and for better or for worse. And I was thinking of I thought of something earlier today, which is not really that related to the next several moments of this discussion. But one of the papers that I read regularly is the Globe and Mail, and there's always a very interesting obituaries at the back. And I had to be honest with myself and recognize that I usually read them if the person is Jewish, and less often if the person is not Jewish. And then I also, the Sunday New York Times, I read all of the wedding announcements for Jewish people, not the others. And then I felt that I should feel guilty about that I don't necessarily uh, relate with everybody as an equal. I'm more interested in my own and less interested in those outside of the world. And I was curious. I'm not going to ask the question here, but I was curious to know if that is just a my quirk, or is that something that is typical of Jews who read newspapers? Do we tend to focus on other Jews, or uh, do we generalize and focus on anybody and treat everybody equally? So that's one of the aspects of guilt in terms of do we feel guilty sometimes because we overemphasize our own and de-emphasize others, or is that just part of human nature? And I will be curious to ask people who are uh, not Jewish if they will do the opposite. I suspect probably less than we do, but I don't know. And one day I will spend more time on that question, which I just thought of earlier today. But I want to jump back to the question of guilt. I will be sharing several moments of introductory remarks, and we'll be happy to open up to questions and discussion as the hour progresses. So one of the more interesting books in my collection that I have begun to slowly dismantle to a certain extent, but one of the books that is of interest, which I don't think anyone, I think I still have it, it's by a journalist whose name is Lori Gottlieb, and the book was published about 10, 15 years ago. It's called The Modern Jewish Girl's Guide to Guilt. How that got to my library, I don't even know. It's not normally a title that I would have, but it's an interesting book. And I didn't read all of it, but I read a lot of it, and a story from that book is one that I want to open with. And so Lori Gottlieb tells the following story, and I'm going to quote directly. She writes, "The phone rings, and I glance down at the caller ID. It says private caller. I've noticed that lots of people have private caller, most of whom get on my nerves. It seems like all of the annoying people have figured out that this is the only way anyone will take their calls. I stare at the phone. It could be a telemarketer, could be my editor. Then again, it could be my mother. And who wants to risk that? I let it go to voicemail. No message. Must have been my mother. It's her passive-aggressive way of guilting me into calling her. I won't call her. If she wants to talk to me, she can leave a message. I pick up the phone and dial. Hi, Mom, I say. I hate myself. I have no willpower. Lori, is that you? I'm her only daughter and she can't figure this out from hi, Mom. Did you just call me? I ask. Why would I call you? She replies. I don't know, because I'm your daughter, maybe? Suddenly I'm worried that she didn't call and hang up after all. Doesn't she think about me? Doesn't she care? Anyhow, she says, changing the subject, what's new? Not much, the usual. Then how come you're never home when I call? My mom says. I knew it. I love that she called, but I hate talking to her. Mom, I'm busy, I say. Okay, go do the usual, whatever that means, she sighs, sending intravenous guilt through the line. I'll go call your brother. At least he talks to me. Mom, love you, she says, and hangs up. And as Lori Gottlieb describes, there's no shortage of guilt in our family relationships. Intentionally or otherwise, deserved or undeserved, we evoke feelings of guilt in our family members. And we feel guilty ourselves for not having measured up to what is expected of us. So we're heading into the holiest season of the year. We are less than a week away from Rosh Hashanah. Just a few days away. And then followed 10 days later, of course, Yom Kippur. And focusing specifically on Yom Kippur, that's when we're supposed to feel guilty. That's when we're supposed to feel tremendous guilt for our failings in life. And it always fascinated me that it's been a while, for unfortunate reasons, that I've not sat at a simcha table. There haven't been simcha tables very much in the last 18 months. It's been a very strange, difficult year and a half, as we all know. But I remember back, the many times over the years, that I'd be seated at a simcha table. And so what invariably would happen when I'd be seated at a table, sometimes I knew the people there, often I never met them, didn't know them. And all of a sudden I'd be getting these unsolicited apologies from people for why they didn't come to shul, why they don't go to shul, why they're not more religious. And I wasn't really seeking their confessions at that moment. I wanted them to pass the bread or the salt. It wasn't that their attendance at shul really didn't interest me, but it was fascinating that they felt a need to, because a rabbi seated at the table, it was time to make a confession. There were times, and not that often, but when I would be walking to shul, and my current route to shul, it's not current, it hasn't been current for a year and a half, but my most recent route to shul, when I'd be walking, there was never the route I would take. Where I lived, there was just I never met anybody, very rarely met anybody. But in the earlier years when I lived in different neighborhoods or different areas, I would occasionally meet people on the street who were Jewish, who knew who I was. And then they would apologize why they weren't going to shul. I hadn't asked them, I wasn't seeking, I wasn't, feeling any animosity towards them, or I wasn't looking down at them or being internally critical that they weren't going to shul. It's a free country. People do what they want to do, and I'm kind of okay with that. But they would say, I guess I should be going to shul. Rabbi, please pray for me. So I said, I'll always pray for you, but love you, be well, and don't worry, whatever. But it was just kind of funny that would happen. And there are also the times that I would in the years up until the last year and a half when I could visit people in the hospital. I made a point, whenever I could avoid, I wouldn't go during meal times. Because God forbid I would be in the room when the meal would be brought and they weren't getting a kosher meal, and they would feel so guilty. And I would say, if that happened, I would say, look, I'm not here as the mashgiach. Don't worry about it. It's not, I'm here because I want you to get well. I'm not, but people sometimes, feel guilt, and part of Yom Kippur is to address that. But we often feel guilt, even for things that that we don't necessarily need to feel that in the eyes of others that we are unworthy. I never, would consider somebody unworthy because they didn't fulfill a certain ritual act that I may fulfill or that others may fulfill that they don't. I would look down on them if they weren't good people, if they weren't mentioned, if they weren't decent, if they were rude or unkind, or if they mistreated somebody else. When I felt a negative feeling towards somebody I was visiting in a hospital, for example, it was because they were very rude to a nurse or to someone else in the room. And that would make me, I didn't care what they were eating. They could have had a shrimp salad. I wasn't interested in what they were eating. That wasn't my purpose. But but in a sense, what I found interesting is the guilt that others feel in the presence of those they feel they have to, show themselves in a certain way. So Yom Kippur is a time when we are, when we're supposed to say that we're guilty. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu, dibarnu, zadofi, hevinu, hirshanu. We abuse, we betray, we're cruel, we destroy, we embitter, we falsify, we gossip, we hate, we insult, we jeer, we kill, hopefully not too often. We lie, we mock, we neglect, we oppress, we pervert, we quarrel, we rebel, we steal, we transgress, we are unkind, we are violent, we are wicked, we are extremists, we yearn to do evil, we lead others astray. We're going to say all those words on Yom Kippur several times. Exactly those words. We say them in Hebrew, so people don't always understand what we're saying, but we're ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu. That's exactly what we're saying. We're pleading guilty to all kinds of violations and suggesting that Jewish guilt isn't just a myth. It's actually something that's in our DNA. It's part of how we identify as human beings. So we tend to, we have this Jewish guilt, but it's a ritualized guilt as well. We are confessing ritually to things that we probably haven't done in many cases. We have we haven't, done a lot of these things, but we don't want to miss anything that we might have done. So we have this laundry list of stuff that we confess to, for better or for worse, and that's part of our ritual. Fortunately, it comes with nice melodies, so we enjoy it when we're doing it. But it's if you look at the words, it's pretty powerful stuff. And I'm just going to parenthetically comment that we have had experience with a lot of political leaders in our country and in the U.S. and elsewhere who commit wrong but will not admit to it. Will never admit that they've done something wrong, and will justify whatever they do. And this is bipartisan. You can say it about any party, any political leader, any president of the U.S. and prime ministers of Canada, who will invariably find a way of justifying an action and not say chatati, because that could affect their popularity. Although I would posit that in a sense they're probably making a mistake, because they would be more popular if they reflect the fact that they are human and they can make a mistake and say chatati, I was wrong. I was wrong. I'm going to learn from my mistake. I'm going to do better next time. And I believe that's the Jewish approach. But a lot of leaders are really afraid to do that and will find a way to justify. And we see that in our newspapers every day. I'm not going to get more specific because I don't want to get political. But it is disappointing when we see people that we respect who are unable to cross that bridge to admission that they're not perfect, that they're going to make mistakes, that they're going to do wrong. So perhaps in having these laundry lists of sins that we confess on Yom Kippur, it's not specifically each sin that we have to check off. Did we do this exactly? We probably didn't do all of these things. Certainly, I hope most of us didn't kill. I mean, that would be really bad. But a lot of the stuff we do, that we do something, we may be cruel, maybe unwittingly, but we do something that can be cruel, that's hurtful. We could be a bit dishonest here and there. There are things that we do that are harmful, that are painful. And so in this laundry list, there'll be things that will apply to almost everybody, and we would rather, maybe confess to them. But what I want to go to the other side of this, and I will be happy, to open this up for discussion in a little while. But I want to take this from a different point of view for a while, because it's true that we all have what to confess. We all do things that are wrong. We all can do better, and sometimes it is a sign of maturity. It's a sign of intellectual honesty. It's a sign of courage, of decency, to come clean when one has made a mistake. And if I give you, my lesson, Practical Rabbinics 2.1, I know that some of my most effective moments over the years was when I would admit that I did something wrong. When somebody, called me on something, and I would, I would thank them, and I would say, you're absolutely right. I missed that. And we usually end up being the best of friends. It never backfired on me. I knew you were wrong. I knew it was always received in a good way. And even in a couple of cases, to tell you the truth, if I'm going to, and I've suggested this to younger rabbis when I would share advice with them, that occasionally someone's going to blame you for something that you didn't do, or that or accuse you of doing something wrong when you didn't do something wrong. And there were a couple of times where I figured, the easiest thing was to eat it. In other words, to accept responsibility, to take the blame, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and I wouldn't have done it any differently, and I shouldn't have done it any differently. But they loved the fact that I said, chatati, that you're right, and I'm sorry, and thank you for. And again, the relationship was fantastic thereafter. So sometimes confessing, even if you're not, you're confessing something that really you didn't do wrong, it's a good strategy in terms of building relationship, because it strengthens the other person. Again, you're not going to confess to something, a horrendous crime, but it means that you didn't make a phone call, which you did make, or that you didn't do something. These are more like the smaller things in life, not something that's huge. Okay, so guilt and confession, up to now, it's not a bad thing, but sometimes I think it is a bad thing, and that's why I want to focus a little bit, because sometimes when one teaches, one has to teach the unexpected, and what one would expect when talking about guilt is it's a good thing to confess, get it off your chest, and sometimes we may go overboard, and this is, I think, where we have to be a bit cautious as a people. And one of my favorite writers in the Jewish world today, and I've inquired in the past, and if I have influence in that direction in the future, I would love to bring her to Toronto if we can do that again at some point. A writer in the New York area. Her name is Dara Horn. She was a student of my former teacher at McGill, and who then went to Harvard, who now is retired, Ruth Weiss, who we had in our shul a couple of times over the years. A great scholar, just a newly retired. And Dara Horn is a novelist and a professor of literature, and a very, very interesting deep thinker. She has a book coming out next week. It's actually being released on Rosh Hashanah. I don't know if she appreciates that, but it's being released next. I have my copy on order, so it will arrive in my house when I can't receive it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And the book is called People Love Dead Jews. It's her first nonfiction work, and talking about how everybody, the world loves to commemorate the Holocaust. The people that don't think much of Jews, they're wonderful about, when we're dead, they're okay with us. When we're alive, it's not so simple. But I'm not dealing with the subject of the book right now, but she wrote an essay many years back, which to me, which stuck with me, and it's one that I reread over and over. It's entitled The Eicha Problem. And at some point I can give you the source of the essay, and I can make copies available maybe at some point if people are interested in reading it. But it's called The Eicha Problem. And dealing with Eicha is the book of Lamentations that we read on Tisha B'Av. And I'm going to just read a brief description from her book, from her essay. She writes, Eicha is a song of mourning, a 5-chapter alphabetical acrostic poem lamenting the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, their sacking of Jerusalem, and the subsequent exile of the Jews to Babylonia. But it isn't an elegy of mourning as much as it is a rant of regret and vengeance. And its regretful vengeance, oddly, isn't primarily directed against the Babylonians. It's not directed against the Babylonians, but against the Jews themselves. Despite the poem's graphic descriptions of what today might be called war crimes perpetrated by the Babylonian forces against Jewish civilians, Babylonia is never mentioned by name in the book's 5 chapters. So who are the villains in this catastrophe of biblical proportions? The Jews. According to the logic of Eicha, it was the Jews themselves who brought about this destruction by provoking God into a dramatic demonstration of divine justice to punish them, the Jews, for maddeningly unspecified sins. End of quote from Dara Horn. So whereas the biblical text is vague when it comes to the sins that caused the destruction, the sages fill in the gaps that among the people's wrongdoings were violating the Shabbat, neglecting to say the Shema morning and night, not properly educating their children, having no shame, and not getting along with each other. And so for centuries, Jews carry with them the guilt that their wrongdoings, rather than oppressive tyrants and malevolent world powers, caused their misfortunes. For the better part of 2 millennia, we allowed ourselves to carry the guilt for all the evils that had befallen us in history. There's something that we say in our Yom Tov prayer, in the Siddur, like we'll say it in the Musaf service on Yom Tov. We say this. It'll be on the first 2 days, and the Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. Every Yom Tov we say, not on the high holidays, but it's in every Yom Tov. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. I say those words because it's in the davening, and I'm the traditionalist, and I don't want to change the wording of the davening. But I struggle with those words because, in terms of what Dara Horn is saying, the theology of Eicha is that we are to blame for the things that happen to us. We have to feel guilty for other people persecuting us because we have done something wrong to justify that persecution. And that becomes, I think, especially in the post-Holocaust era of history, a very problematic theology. For me, it's a very problematic theology. Members of the congregation shared with me in the past stories of being visited by Hasidic rabbis in the hospital, and in cases, for example, in which, God forbid, a child or a young person was tragically ill with an incurable disease. And the words that the visiting rabbi offered were, "Have you checked your mezuzahs lately?" And when I hear that, I'm absolutely appalled. In other words, what they're really saying to the parents who are struggling with their sick child, or the family member, your loved one who's in terrible shape, you're struggling, and what could I have done? And this religious figure is coming in and saying, well, you didn't do enough because you didn't check your mezuzahs. It's your fault that this is happening. They're not using those words, but that's really what they're saying. And I think it's horrific. I think that's horrific. And when someone had
Peppa, you're frozen.
Stuck.
You are stuck.
Don't worry, he can't hear you.
That's not necessarily true. Mute up. Can you go back to mute?
Seems to be working now. Okay, sorry about that. That little technological grip gaffe here. Okay, so let me continue where I left, where I so rudely interrupted. Although that may have been a divine signal that I better be careful what I'm saying, because it was actually kind of ironic what I was about to say when I got cut off. I was about to say that if somebody were to show me absolute proof that God would cause the death of an individual, of a family member, because others in the family had neglected a ritual obligation, I would publicly declare my not belief, that I could not believe in such a God who would be so cruel. I think that's a tremendous distortion of theology and a very dangerous position to take. So I would certainly advocate that not be our standard, that not be the way we view the world, and that we have a more sophisticated sense of how we should feel guilt. I mean, how we should understand guilt, and how we recognize that we should not take upon ourselves personal blame when others wrong us. I'm actually going to have to move my iPad because I need a text that is on my computer, which is not, which seems to have gone on the fritz. Okay, 1 second. So I'm you're seeing all kinds of angles of my office right now, of my home office. Okay, so I want to share with you a story that was told from one of the greats of Yiddish literature, Yud Peretz, and his story is called The Shabbos Goy. And many years ago, I shared this, I think on Yom Kippur. And the story is about a Jew whose name is Yankel, a good Jewish name. And his Shabbos Goy, the non-Jewish servant, the Shabbos Goy is who he hired to do things on Shabbos that he wasn't permitted to do. He would physically assault him. He had the Gentile that he hired to work for him on Shabbat. He would physically assault him. He was a bully, and Yankov was meek, and so on each occasion, Yankov would be in a great deal of pain, and he approached the rabbi, saying, "Look at this, the Shabbos Goy, he beats me up. Help me." And so the rabbi reasons that, whatever the Shabbos Goy did, you deserved it. Because one day he knocked out some of his teeth, and the rabbi says, "Well, your teeth were too perfect. It made the non-Jew jealous, so that's why he broke your teeth." And then another time, every time he would be assaulted by this Shabbos Goy, the rabbi would justify what the Shabbos Goy did and blame the Jew, blame Yankala. He was at fault. He's the one that caused the Shabbos Goy to harm him, to injure him. So at some point, it just reached a point of absurdity. He's going to be killed. He couldn't handle this anymore. So the rabbi said, "You got to move away, so that you won't arouse in the Gentile more harm." And he said also, because you basically give him some money, give him a gift, because you should make him, you want to assuage him and basically seek his forgiveness. So the story, of course, is it's a mashal, it's a motif to suggest that we often take upon ourselves guilt that we don't deserve. The same way that our theology over the millennia suggested that we should assume the blame, what Darahorn calls the Eicha problem, that we assume the blame for having been oppressed, for having been persecuted, for having been murdered, and that's something that we need to assume, to take upon that guilt. That's appropriate, that's justified, that's what we need to do. And basically, I think I agree with Darahorn. I think that's extremely problematic. Just as we feel that the Shabbos Goy story, it's absurd that this Yankala should take personal responsibility and it's his fault that this Shabbos Goy is picking on him and hurting him and abusing him. It's his fault. And we see that, by the way, that happens in life. People who are abused, we have the whole the battered spouse syndrome, where people who are abused often are counseled, or they themselves feel, what am I doing wrong? Why am I provoking this anger in my husband, in my spouse? What am I doing wrong? And one needs to say, any competent therapist is going to say, that's not the right question. It's not you, it's him, it's her. You're the victim. You're not the perpetrator here, and don't take the blame. But sometimes in Jewish history, we have been subject to taking upon guilt that we shouldn't be taking on. It's the lousy Babylonians, it's the Cossacks, it's all these marauders who persecuted us. They're the ones to blame, not us. Not us. Is that, are we so insecure that we have to take upon that guilt? And that's, something that, especially after the Holocaust, I think we recognize that we can't do that anymore. It probably was challenging to do throughout history, but it's something that now becomes obscene, I would say, after the 6 million. Because there are those, to this day, there are those who advocate that we deserved it, that it was because of our sins. Because of our sins, we did stuff wrong, and God punished us by allowing the Nazis to murder 6 million Jews. And so the babies that were murdered in front of their parents, they're being punished for we can't, how do you believe in a God who would allow that to happen? It just becomes something that it's completely inconsonant with any morality that we can hold on to. And so I think we have to be more sophisticated in our faith and our understanding. We learn from history, and at some point we advance and we mature, and we recognize that we can take on that onus, that responsibility, that blame. It's not our fault, and we're not going to allow the finger to be pointed at us for the sufferings of the Jewish people in history. Let's go back to almost 120 years, 1903, summer of 1903, when Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was at the time a 30-year-old poet from Odessa, he was sent on a mission to Kishinev to investigate what happened earlier that year in a terrible pogrom, a very traumatic event. The Kishinev pogrom, prior to the Holocaust, it was one of the more traumatic events of our history, and people were were incredibly distressed. And so there was a mission sent, a historical commission, to interview the survivors of the pogrom, to report what happened. So Bialik goes to Odessa. He goes to Kishinev, and he investigates. And he comes back to Odessa, and then he writes one of his most famous poems called Be'ir HaHarega, in the city of slaughter. And this is a poem, a very long poem, that is one of the most powerful, probably in the history of Hebrew literature. And I would even say that it is a poem that shaped modern Jewish history. So what happens with this poem? And basically, what Bialik does here goes against what I just said, because he targets not the Cossacks, not the enemy, the people that did the murdering, the plundering, the killing, the raping, all of the terrible stuff they did in the pogrom, but he attacks the Jews, but not for the reason that the Jews did something to deserve what happened to them. That's not what he says.
But what he says is the following. He says, I'm quoting the poem now. They're beating their breasts, they're confessing their sins. They're saying, Ashamnu bagadnu, sound familiar? We've transgressed, we've trespassed. The libam lo yamin lipihem. Their hearts don't believe their mouths. Can a shattered idol sin? Can shards of pottery have trespassed? And God says in the poet's words, why are they praying to me? Daber alehem vayiramu. Speak to these people that are praying to me, God says, according to the poet. Tell them to scream. Tell them to roar. So he's not saying that the people are to blame for what happened to them. He's not taking on that theological burden. But he's also not happy with the people because they are standing up and confessing their sins before God. Probably saw them on Yom Kippur follow, because he was there in Odessa for a while. He probably, he was there the summertime. He probably stayed through Yom Tov. And he's seeing them, Ashamnu Bagadnu, and he's furious at them, not because they were responsible for what happened to them, because they weren't. Why aren't they screaming at God? Why are they being passive? Why aren't they saying to God, and God is saying this according to the poet, according to Bialik, it's God who says to yell, scream at me, saying, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore. And why are the people being passive? Why are they just continuing on as they always have, saying the same davening and doing the same ritual and not shaking the very foundations of the world? And this poem had tremendous impact in the Jewish world. And I think some have argued, and I believe correctly, that it impacted upon those who were part of the Zionist revolution. That it encouraged people further that we can't tolerate being the passive victims of history anymore. We are going to break from the past. We are going to not wait for the Mashiach, for which they've not been yet forgiven by the Haredi Jewish world to this day, but we're not going to wait for the Messiah. We're not going to wait for God to rescue us, because that ain't happening anytime soon. We're going to do it ourselves. We're going to take upon the challenge, the responsibility, the mission of building a secure Jewish tomorrow. And so Bialik's poem, in reaction to what he learned and what he saw in Kishinev, his reaction to what he saw in Kishinev and to what the stories that he heard, the horrible stories that he heard, and then seeing these people still davening and still shuckling and still as if nothing had happened, through his poetry says, wake up. Okay, you want to daven, that's fine, that's good. But finish shacharit, take off the tefillin, and go fight. Go yell and go scream, shake the foundations of the world so that we have a secure future. And so there's a limitation to guilt. In other words, sometimes it's appropriate to feel guilt, to recognize that we need to improve, to admit that when we make a mistake, to seek to improve, to apologize to those we may have hurt. And Yom Kippur says that if we've harmed another individual, the Mishnah tells us on Yom Kippur, we can only seek forgiveness if we have personally reached out to that person. We can't daven and be forgiven. We have to actually seek amends from the individual who we have wronged. Through God, we can daven and when we miss the daven and pray to God to be forgiven, that we missed shacharit yesterday, that we weren't so good about kashrut, that we weren't so great about Shabbos, that we can seek forgiveness from God. But when we wrong another human being, we have to seek that forgiveness directly from that human being. But what we learn, but what's most important is where do we cross a line when we got to stop feeling guilty and not take upon guilt for our survival, not taking upon guilt for fighting for our future, and not taking upon guilt because sometimes Israel has to do stuff that is tough. Sometimes Israel has to do stuff that doesn't look good in the newspapers. And yet we need not feel guilty for being strong, for being courageous, and for taking a stand and not allowing ourselves to be the victims of history anymore. So I'm going to hit pause. Wait a minute, excuse me. And I'm going to see if there are, probably the easiest thing to do, because it's really difficult on Zoom. If I can, again, I'm accessing this through, I have to find the chat here, excuse me. I'm not used to doing this on my iPad. Okay, here's chat. So I see I have a question from Elise, and others, please feel free to put questions in the chat if you have them. Elise is asking, how should we be regarding Eicha? Should we continue to say it out of tradition? Should we be coming up with a parallel text that reflects the modern theology? Well, I think it's a great question. I would still read Eicha because we still value the traditional text, just like I say, I still daven Musaf, even though I struggle with it, but it doesn't mean that you can't, that I still in my own mind recognize the limitation of that prayer and how we have to go beyond it at times. We can still read Eicha because it's an important part of our liturgical heritage, but I believe that part of our discussion needs to be, how do we move beyond that? In other words, how do we recognize that we live in a world where we have to be willing to say that we do not have to apologize for remaining Jewish today, that we do not have to apologize to continuing on in our Jewish heritage, that we do not have to apologize for fighting so that Jews in the future can be secure in their Jewishness, can raise children out without fear, and can be in a world where anti-Semitism is no longer a guiding force in our society. I think, by the way, a lot of people are, rightfully concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in the world, and we know there've been increased incidents in our communities in North America, and Europe, and other places. Europe even worse. It's disconcerting. But I think what we have today, which we have not had in the past, is that leaders, national leaders, are speaking out against anti-Semitism and are taking it seriously, and we're not alone and isolated in the world as we once were. It's still a problem, but the world reacts in a different way, and I think we have to be grateful for that. But we know that we've learned that we have to go beyond the theology of the ancient world, the ancient Jewish world, in responding to modern history. And I think the Holocaust was a jumping off point when we're no longer able to passively reflect upon what we have it coming to us. Bialik may have been one of the first steps in that direction, even prior to the Holocaust, leading us and saying that it's just not normal, it's not correct for us to carry on as if nothing has happened. We have to threaten, basically, we have to yell and scream in order to create a better day. We have to not, the poem is a very terrible, very difficult poem, and it's very long, and he talks about basically, men who were hiding their eyes and hiding in a closet where women were being raped because they didn't want to, God forbid, see a woman in a state of impurity or in a state of, and he was appalled by that. In other words, at this point, there's a point where you forget about the Shulchan Aruch, go save the woman. His orthodoxy, because he's a yeshiva bacher, was definitely threatened by what he saw, and he became this activist wanting us to really take history in our own hands. Let me see if there are any other questions in the chat. Again, please, if you have any, please come forward with them. So let me ask you a question. What should we feel guilty about? And I'm just trying to see, I can't, I wish I could get back on my computer, because let me see if I can, because then I can see everybody. I'm going to try to do that again. Let's see if I can get it up and running again there. Give me a moment. let's see if I'm going to try to go on again. Let's see if I look at the Gail.
Recording in
Oh,
progress.
good. I'm getting on. Okay, good. Now I'm back on this.
Okay, now we're back on. I love technology. I really do. Okay. Okay, now I can see everybody again. Wonderful. So now I can see if anyone has a question. I can see.
But we can't see you.
You can't see me. Oh, because I didn't turn on my. Yeah, now you can see me. You see. Okay. This shouldn't be this difficult. I don't know why I'm having such a hard. It's a mode of practice. Okay, now I'm seeing. I think in a white screen. Oh, it went off again. No. Why is my video off? Start video. Oh, I'm on twice. That's the problem. Okay, because I didn't shut down my iPad. Okay. So hi everybody again. Are there any other questions or comments? At what point? Where should we feel guilty? Where shouldn't we feel? Where shouldn't we feel guilty? Anybody? You're so quiet. Let me look. I'm only seeing one screen here. Let me see if I can get the other screen. Okay. You still can't see me? You're saying you can't see me? You don't see me? I'm seeing myself. You don't see me?
We don't see you.
You don't see me? That's weird because let me.
Yes, we see you.
If I'm waving, do you see me waving?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Because there's one. By the way, you're going to see one screen that's blank because
We see you again.
He's frozen again.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Shana Tova, have a great, healthy new year. Everybody should just enjoy, and let's hope that next year is better than last year.
Sorry, who's talking?
It's Ribby. Bye.
Shana Tova, everybody.
I don't leave. I come back.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
I don't think we should leave the rabbi just hanging in there and not knowing
I'm
if
gonna
they're
wait.
on or off. Yeah, we'll
Let's
wait.
wait for him. Yeah.
I agree.
He's well worth waiting for.
Okay,
Yeah.
at least I heard that I'm well worth waiting for. I hope that's true. That was you don't want me to get have to be you don't want this to go to my head, but it's crazy. My technology usually works. I don't know why it's causing me such pain because I'm being heretical tonight. I don't know why. It's probably also because I'm not used to talking this late. I normally it's at this stage of life it's 8 o'clock. It's almost 9 o'clock. It's really late. But we don't. I'm glad I have. So I'm going to basically, let's say 50 already. I'll make a couple of concluding remarks, and if anybody, I'll try to access the chat. It's harder for me to do it in. Let's see if it's harder for me to do it in. Okay, I got something here from Barbara Kutchberg. Okay, Barbara, when I say a shamnu, I always wonder who am I confessing for. The words are collective, not personal. Is there any commentary about the collective confessional? Yeah, it's a great question. One of the I mentioned this actually in my sermon on Yom Kippur, but I'll give you a preview now. There's a fascinating declaration that we say prior to Kol Nidre, that we have are given permission Lihitpalel im ha'arvayanim. We're given permission on this night to pray with sinners. And another version, which is not in our machzor, but is in some machzorim, in some traditions, reads it differently and says, we sinners are given permission to pray with the congregation. But it's fascinating. So you have the idea that community means that we are coming together, and all of us have done different things, but we come together, each with our own peckle of sins, of wrongdoing, of misdeeds, and we still that forms a union. And the Talmud says, and I'm going to mention this on Yom Kippur, the Talmud says that you can't have a fast day without davening with sinners. In other words, that is essential, because what does being a sinner mean? A sinner doesn't mean that we don't want to get the impression that it's necessarily the most awful human being on the planet. But we all, a sin, a chait is basically, it's missing the mark. It's making a mistake. It's making an error. It's part of the human makeup. It's part of the human fabric. It's something of which we're all susceptible. We're going to miss sometimes. We're going to miss sometimes. We're going to miss the mark. That's part of being human. And sometimes it's more severe, sometimes it's less severe. But there are always things that we do that are problematic. And we do the al-chait, we're going to do 30 to 40% are sins of speech, of which we're all guilty. We all gossip. I mean, there's so many books written on Lashon Hara, on gossip. It's because it's so much fun. We love doing it. It gives us so much pleasure. It's so human to gossip, but it's considered a certain sense terrible. It's bad, because you shouldn't say bad things about other people. Whenever, when I love this, when I do these, when I talk to families before funerals and I ask if I didn't know, tell me about your father, tell me about your husband or your wife, tell me something about him, about her. And the one thing that I never repeat, you'll never hear me say a direct quote from the family, and sometimes I do quote from the family, I'll never say, he never said a bad word about anybody. I think that's rare. And I would say maybe there was one time in 1974, March, it was a cold day, and he said a bad word about somebody. I mean, because that's so human. I mean, it's really, and maybe there are people who've never, I guess there are people who are not known for that. Their specialty is not gossip. They don't like to say bad things about other people. But it's so hard not to fall into that trap. That's why a huge number of the al-chaits are related to speech. Gossip and slander and malicious, all of the talebearing, there's all kinds of stuff that relates to speech, because that's something, it's not all relating to incest and murder and rape and theft. I mean, that's there too, but it's not in the same, because that's more rare, thankfully. But there's stuff that we all do. So part of the the reason why we say all of these things is to bring the collective together. We're part of a community of people that are imperfect, some more imperfect than others, but we're all part of, that's our community, and that's what makes collectivity possible. If we're going to say we're only going to daven with people as perfect as we are, whatever that means, you're going to have a very small congregation. Look, you'll have nobody. I mean, you yourself won't qualify. You won't be able to be a member of that club. So I'm going to go to Alan. I see he has a question. Let me go to the chat. These are great questions. Let me just get it. Okay. This is if I could answer this question that Alan asked, I'd be very proud of myself, but I can't really answer. But it's a great question. It's the question of the question of the century. We should blame the Nazis for the Holocaust. Where does God fit in? I've told this story before, and I'm going to repeat it because it's a great answer to your question, your great question. And that was a story about my late teacher, late Rabbi Moshe Zucker. I've told a lot of funny stories about him because he was a very eccentric, like absent-minded professor. You look up the word in the dictionary, it's his picture. But he was a great Talmudist, a great scholar. One of my classmates is delivering his graduation sermon on a Shabbat in the seminary synagogue, and his theme was explaining God's role in the Holocaust. In other words, justifying God in the Holocaust. So walking out of shul, and Rabbi Zucker turns to him and he says, God could use a better lawyer. In other words, can't do it. In other words, we can't justify it. That's one of the great questions. You read Elie Wiesel, and others, and Elie Wiesel, Alav Shalom, was a man of great faith. He was a Shomer Shabbos. He was very traditional. Although it took him a while to get to that point. If you read some of the stories about him, he was very angry after the, understandably after what he went through. And it took him a long time to come back to God. But basically, he didn't let God off the hook. And I think we have to say that we don't. That's a question that will always be there. And I'm not sure we necessarily want to blame God, because God creates humankind, and humankind have moral responsibility, and they have to shape their moral destiny. God doesn't control everything we do. But if God could intervene with the Israelites in Egypt and intervene at other points in history, why the silence now? And it's a tremendously challenging problem. And I always understand, by the way, when people who survived the Shoah lose their faith. I understand. I mean, I can't criticize them for that. They say they've given up on God. What God let this happen to their families, their communities were destroyed. I understand. I can't argue against that. I mean, there's some who come with a resurgence of faith, but many who lost faith. Hard to challenge that. It really is. There's a difference between shame and guilt. I guess the difference that's also part of Alan's question. Well, in Hebrew it would be busha and being ashamed, which sounds like shame. It sounds like shame, but ashamed. So the guilt and shame. Guilt is normally when we have done something wrong, that we have committed a wrongdoing. Shame is when we're embarrassed, but we feel bad about having done something. And guilt, you may be guilty of something and not feel shame. There were a lot of examples in public life of people who've done something wrong, but they don't seem to feel ashamed of what they've done. Some political leaders who I won't mention, but have, do awful things, but don't have an ounce of shame. Some people who do something that's not so bad, but really feel ashamed of what they did. They're really embarrassed by what they did. So sometimes, by the way, shame can be a good thing to a certain extent, because it does influence our behavior. It does influence, we're careful, we're cautious. We don't want to appear in a place where we shouldn't be seen. We'd be ashamed of being seen in a certain place. There's the concept in Jewish law of marit ayin, of basically, even if you haven't done something wrong, the appearance is embarrassing to you, so you don't want to be putting yourself in an embarrassing position. It is considered, by the way, it is sinful. It is, it is extremely, you should be guilt-ridden. You should feel guilt. If you cause another person to feel shame, if you bring shame upon another person. So there are subtle differences, but it's a very interesting question. And Cora, question, and that might be the last one. Yeah, I see we're already at 9 o'clock. I'll end with this question. Is there discussion around deep-seated collective guilt versus collective guilt around a single event? Okay, got you. Like, in other words, Jewish guilt being basically, it's something that's part of our DNA. It's part of intrinsic to, it's part of who we are, because we just tend to feel, there's such a thing as Jewish guilt, but in a sense, a guilt that is kind of merited in a certain sense, but people who have been part of a totality, a society which perpetrated a great travesty on humanity. I think that I don't feel sorry the fact that Germany bears a tremendous guilt to this day. And it was German guilt that helped build Israel. The reparations which Ben Gurion supported, which Begin never accepted. Begin hated the fact that Israel took reparation money from Germany. But Ben Gurion said correctly that money was essential for us to build a country. And that was that it was, in a sense, life-sustaining, but it came out of guilt. It didn't come all of a sudden that Germany had a revelation that it was a great mitzvah to build the state of Israel. But they recognized the post-Holocaust generation. I mean, they were those who were part of that generation, but those who succeeded, they recognized they had done something horrific, and they had to seek amends. So that's a merited guilt. I think we have to be careful in terms of how we deal with that today, with second and third generation post-Holocaust Germans who are often very, very, very good to the Jewish people. Germany, the state is very supportive of of synagogues. We have a Masorti, a rabbinical school now that gets a lot of government funding. How much government funding goes into our religious centers in Canada, the US? Nothing. But Germany is very supportive of Jewish life, and part of that stems from that post-Holocaust guilt for sure, which again is somewhat merited, but in a sense we also have to recognize that good things have come from that. But it's very complicated, of course. There are people who survived the Shoah and people who didn't, but who are very sensitive to it, who will never go to Germany, who will never buy a German product. But we see that, in Israel, you can't walk 2 steps without seeing a German car. A Mercedes bus or a taxi. It's very, all over the place. It's interesting. I've not yet gotten to the point of buying a German car. I'm sort of stuck up with Japanese cars at this point, but I do have a German Razor, although as you may have noticed, I haven't used it too much lately. But I do have a Braun shaver, which is a German product. But there are, Jews who would never buy anything German and Jews who will never visit Germany. I was in Berlin a couple of years ago, which was a very meaningful visit, but it was hard walking into the airport and seeing Achtung in a big sign, and it was challenging. But how to, so I think there is a difference between these. Guilt is a very complicated subject. So I'm going to conclude with one sentence by saying it is appropriate to feel a certain amount of guilt in terms of our behavior to try to improve, but we have to be careful historically not to take that guilt too far, and to recognize that we don't need to apologize for being Jewish today or for what's happened to us. And we should recognize, in a sense, that there's good and evil in the world, and we've often been victimized by evil, and we need to take no responsibility for that. The victim is not, should not be feeling guilt or any kind of collaboration in terms of what he or she is experiencing. That's an amazingly complex issue, and we've only scratched the surface today. Guilt is really, again, we feel some guilt. We're going to say Hashem Chatanu. We're going to recite confessionals. We're going to do all that stuff. But I think we also have to feel pretty proud of what we've accomplished as a people, and pretty grateful for the fact that we've come this far in history. And with God's help, we're going to go a whole lot further in the generations to come. So thank you all for being so, for coming in such numbers. I'm really impressed. I thought I'd be here with myself, but so many of you came. I'm very impressed and very gratified. Great to see all of you. And I look forward to, even though you're going to see a little less of me these days, you're going to get stuck with me a little bit. You're stuck with me over the high holidays. You're stuck with me over the high holidays, and you'll be stuck, here and there you'll see me. I'm not totally disappearing. I'm still in the community. So we'll still see each other. I'm going to be teaching some classes during the year and doing some stuff. And so we'll still connect, and feel free to email me if you have questions. Feel free to be in touch with me. I'm happy to be in touch with you. I haven't disappeared, even though I'm not an active presence in the shul right now. I have to create a certain amount of space so that you get used to the transition. But it is good to see all of you tonight, and I wish all of you a Shana Tova Mituka, sweet and happy year, K'tiva v'chatima tova, that you should be inscribed for good and healthy years, and be safe and be well and be vaccinated, which I'm assuming you all are, and be good and take care of each other, love each other, and stay Jewish and support Israel and do mitzvahs, but and take care of yourselves and be good. It's great to see all of you, and thank you for being here. And don't feel too guilty. Feel a bit guilty, but not too guilty.
Rabbi. Good job,
Rabbi.
everybody.
Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.